A prison unlike any other stretched across the barren wasteland of Virex. 9. A world carved from obsidian storms and silent ruin. The facility stood alone, wrapped in layers of forgotten technology, ancient barriers humming with an energy so old that even the Empire's greatest minds dared not tamper with it. At its heart lay the most infamous cell in the known galaxy, a place where time had bent and twisted around its sole inhabitant for 3,821 years. No one spoke of what resided inside, not freely, and certainly not without a glance over their shoulder. Sergeant Elias Voss had heard the whispers before. He had seen the looks of unease in the war-hardened officers when they muttered about the thing inside the cell. Some called it a god, others a curse, but all agreed on one thing. No one who entered that chamber ever returned. So when he stood before the throne of the imperial sovereign himself and received his orders, he nearly laughed, mistaking it for some elaborate test of loyalty. "You will feed it," the emperor had said, his voice impassive. The words settled like a stone in Elias's chest. He was a soldier, a man bred for battle, trained to navigate fields of corpses and fire. Not whatever this was. But orders were orders, and the sovereign's gaze held no room for argument. The journey to Virex. 9 was escorted by a fleet more suited for war than a simple delivery. The ship's pilot barely spoke, avoiding Elias's gaze whenever he inquired about the prison's history. When they finally landed, he was greeted by a handful of officers who seemed caught between morbid fascination and outright pity. Their uniforms bore the mark of those stationed here for decades, yet none looked as though they had ever set foot near the cell. A warden with sunken eyes and an artificial spine led him through the corridors. The air carried a weight that pressed against the skin, as though the walls themselves resisted their presence. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became, until only the rhythmic hum of containment fields filled the silence. "They say it doesn't need to eat," the warden muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the emperor insists." Elias remained silent. He had no intention of entertaining ghost stories, but even he could feel the unnatural stillness in the air. They stopped before a vast door, a relic of a time when the Empire had been desperate enough to build such things. It was a construct of material unknown to modern science, untouched by rust or decay. Glyphs, etched in a language long extinct, coursed with a faint, pulsing light. The warden swallowed hard before stepping aside, gesturing for Elias to enter. He took a breath, adjusted the tray in his hands, and stepped through. The chamber was larger than he expected. The walls stretched endlessly, disappearing into shadows that seemed to move on their own. There was no furniture, no adornments, just the abyssal void of a prison meant to contain something beyond comprehension. And there, in the center, sitting as though it had simply wandered in and forgotten to leave, was a cat. For a moment, Elias almost laughed. He had expected a beast, a monster, some twisted thing of legend. Instead, an ordinary feline regarded him with calm, golden eyes. Its fur was sleek, dark as the void outside the cell, its tail flicking lazily against the floor. But something in the way it stared at him made his breath hitch. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Elias set the tray down, watching for any reaction. The cat blinked once. Then, without moving its mouth, a voice, soft, ageless, and far too knowing, filled his mind. "You are the first," it said, "in a very long time." Elias stiffened, every muscle in his body screaming to run, to unmake the choices that had led him here. But he was not a coward. "I was sent to feed you," he said, his own voice sounding small. The cat tilted its head, and the air around them seemed to ripple. The symbols on the walls pulsed once, then stilled. "How curious," the voice mused. "Tell me, human, why do you obey?" Elias had faced down death on more occasions than he cared to count, but never had he felt as exposed as he did now. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was the sensation of standing before something that saw through him, through the layers of duty and flesh, straight to whatever remained underneath. He clenched his jaw. "Because I was ordered to." The cat. No, the thing that wore the shape of a cat. regarded him for a long moment before a soft, almost amused sound echoed through the space. It was laughter, though how something without lips could laugh, he had no idea. Obedience, it mused, curling its tail around itself. A most fragile chain. Elias exhaled, realizing only then that he had been holding his breath. He turned to leave, deciding he had done what was required of him. But as he moved toward the threshold, the cat's voice threaded through his mind once more, softer this time. "You will return," it said. Not a question, a certainty, and against all reason, Elias knew it was right. The second time Elias stepped into the chamber, the cat was waiting. It sat precisely where he had left it, its golden eyes half-lidded, tail flicking in slow, deliberate arcs. The tray in his hands felt heavier than before, though nothing about the contents had changed. He placed it down carefully, watching for a reaction, but the cat merely observed him as though he were the curiosity, not the other way around. "You returned," the voice murmured in his mind. Elias kept his expression neutral. "I was ordered to." The cat stretched, arching its back in a manner so natural, so ordinary, that for a moment it was easy to forget what it was. Then it turned those eyes on him again, and the weight of its presence settled over him like an unseen hand pressing against his thoughts. "And do you always follow orders without question?" Elias hesitated. It was a dangerous question, one with answers that could fracture a life. He had spent years following orders, on war-torn planets, in the cold depths of space, in places where hesitation meant death. He had not always agreed, but he had obeyed because that was what soldiers did. "You're a prisoner," he said instead. "It's my duty to ensure you don't starve." The cat let out a sound that might have been amusement. "You believe I am confined?" Elias narrowed his eyes. "Aren't you?" The cat's tail curled around its paws. "I wonder what your emperor has told you. That I am dangerous? That I am something to be contained?" "You are dangerous," Elias said. "Am I?" It tilted its head. "And what exactly do you think I am?" Elias had no answer to that. The reports, what little he had been permitted to access, spoke only in vague, contradictory terms. A relic of war, a failed experiment, a divine being, a monster. But none of those descriptions explained why the most powerful empire in the known universe had chosen to seal away a single creature for nearly 4 millennia instead of destroying it. The silence stretched between them. Then the cat rose and padded toward the untouched food, sniffing at it with faint curiosity. "It has been some time since I last spoke with a human," it said, almost absently. "They used to come in droves. Pilgrims, warriors, scholars. They all asked the same questions. Some sought knowledge, others power. And then, one day, they simply stopped coming." Elias watched as it took a delicate bite, chewing with deliberate slowness. "Why?" The cat lifted its gaze to him again. "Because they were afraid of what I might tell them." Elias's fingers twitched at his side. "And what is that?" The cat did not answer immediately. Instead, it padded closer, circling him in slow, fluid steps. The air around them seemed to ripple, a subtle shift that made his vision blur at the edges. Then, without warning, the world fell away. He was no longer in the chamber. The stars stretched infinitely above, burning in colors he had no name for. He stood upon nothing, yet he did not fall. Around him, entire planets crumbled into dust, devoured by something vast and insatiable. He heard screams, not of pain, but of erasure, voices unraveling into nothingness. And in the center of it all, watching with quiet patience, sat the cat. A blink, and the vision vanished. The chamber returned, solid and real, but the weight of what he had seen pressed against his skull like an iron band. Elias staggered back, breath sharp. What was that?" The cat regarded him with something close to pity. A memory. His pulse pounded against his ribs. "Whose?" The cat did not answer. Elias clenched his jaw, grounding himself in the feel of his own breath, the cool metal of his uniform pressing against his skin. He had seen war before. Entire civilizations turned to cinders in the wake of the Empire's conquests, but nothing like that. That was annihilation on a scale beyond comprehension. "You still haven't answered my question," he said finally, forcing steel into his voice. The cat blinked slowly. And you still haven't asked the right one. Elias exhaled sharply, frustration curling in his gut. Fine. What do you want from me? The cat's tail flicked. A simple thing. Bring me something. Elias narrowed his eyes. Bring you what? A key. He frowned. A key to what? The cat only purred. You'll know it when you find it. The air in the chamber seemed to shift again, that same subtle disturbance that made his vision blur. And then the weight lifted, and the moment passed, as if nothing had happened. Elias knew he should refuse. Knew that whatever this creature was, whatever game it was playing, it was beyond his understanding. And yet, some part of him, the same part that had led him to question, to wonder, would not let the words die on his tongue. Why should I trust you? He asked. The cat regarded him with something almost like amusement. You shouldn't. And yet, even as Elias turned to leave, the words had already settled inside him, taking root. Elias knew he should have walked away. The moment he left the cell, he should have reported the conversation, should have let the Emperor's enforcers handle whatever was brewing inside that chamber. But he didn't. Instead, he found himself returning to his quarters, the cat's words slithering through his thoughts like an unshakable shadow. You'll know it when you find it. It was nonsense. It should have been nonsense. And yet, Elias had been a soldier long enough to trust his instincts. And those instincts told him that whatever was happening inside that cell was bigger than he could yet understand. More than that, they whispered something even more unsettling. He was already part of it. Sleep was elusive that night. He dreamt of vast, crumbling worlds and golden eyes watching from the void. When he woke, his pulse was hammering. The image of the cat's gaze still burned behind his eyelids. The next morning, he searched. It was careful work. He asked no direct questions, made no obvious moves, just let his attention drift through the facility's records, through security reports, through the long and tangled history of the prison itself. Most of it was standard bureaucracy, logs of the containment measures, reports on environmental stability, countless years of nothing happening. But buried beneath the routine, he found something odd. A single object transferred to the facility 3,000 years ago. No description, no details, just a designation. Relic 017. No one had accessed it since. The vault was located deep beneath the main complex, past layers of security that had been built long before any of the current wardens had been born. The guards barely remembered the relic existed at all, and when Elias inquired, their responses were vague, dismissive. Asterisk some old artifact. No purpose. No risk. Asterisk. They let him in, without question. Inside, the vault was cold and silent. Rows of containment units lined the walls, filled with forgotten things that no one had deemed important enough to retrieve. And there, in the center, resting on a pedestal of reinforced alloy, was a key. It was small, simple, unremarkable. Elias stepped closer. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the air around him shifted. The lights flickered. A pulse of something unseen rippled through the room, curling around his bones. He jerked his hand back, breath unsteady, but the sensation had already passed. The key sat in his palm, cold and inert. He didn't know why, but he felt certain it was the right one. Returning to the cell felt different this time. The corridors were the same, the guards as wary as ever, but there was a weight pressing against his ribs, something beyond nerves, beyond fear. The cat had been waiting for this. The door slid open, and the golden eyes met his before he had fully stepped inside. The food tray was forgotten. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the key, holding it up without a word. The cat purred. It rose with unhurried grace, padding toward him with a quiet satisfaction that made his skin crawl. Then, in a motion too smooth to be natural, it lifted one paw and tapped the key. The world broke. Elias staggered as the walls flickered, as the chamber around him shifted, the ancient glyphs pulsing with a sudden, violent light. The air thickened, distorting like heat haze, and beneath his boots, the floor trembled. Then, just as suddenly, the moment passed. Silence. The cat sat once more, tail curled neatly around its paws. The key had vanished. Elias swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "What did you just do?" The cat yawned. "I unlocked the door." The words sent a cold spike through his spine. He turned sharply, scanning the chamber walls, searching for something, anything that had changed. But the prison looked the same. The containment fields still hummed, the barriers still held. "You're still here," Elias said slowly. The cat blinked lazily. "Of course." Elias exhaled sharply, trying to steady his pulse. "Then what did that key open?" The cat's gaze held his, unblinking. "Not all doors are visible." The words settled like a weight in his chest. He didn't understand them, not fully, but he understood enough to know that something had shifted, something irreversible. Then the alarms began to wail. Elias tensed as red lights flared along the chamber walls, as the distant echo of shouting voices reached his ears. The security systems flared to life, containment protocols activating across the facility. His comm crackled, frantic voices, confusion, fear. He turned back to the cat, pulse hammering. "What did you do?" It purred again, slow and deliberate. "Not all doors are visible," it repeated, rising to its feet. "But all doors lead somewhere." The cell's reinforced barriers flickered. Panic surged through Elias's veins. He had broken something. He knew it, even if he didn't understand how. His training screamed at him to act, to contain whatever was happening, but he already knew this was beyond him. The door to the chamber slammed open. Armed guards flooded the room, weapons raised, their faces carved with urgency. At their center stood the warden, his expression a mask of barely restrained terror. "Step away from it," he barked. Elias lifted his hands, more out of instinct than obedience. "I didn't." The warden wasn't looking at him. His gaze was locked on the cat. "We have to lock it down," one of the officers muttered. "Now." The containment barriers surged, flickering with renewed force. The cat remained perfectly still, unconcerned, as though none of this was of any consequence. Elias's stomach twisted. It wasn't escaping. It had never intended to escape. It had made him open the door. The realization struck like a blow, cold and sharp. He had followed the thread exactly as it had intended, had brought the key, had activated something beyond his understanding. But if it wasn't for the cat, if it wasn't for its freedom, then what had he just unleashed? The alarms blared louder. The warden barked orders, containment reinforcements were called, and the facility locked itself into high alert. But through it all, the cat simply sat, golden eyes half-lidded, a small, knowing smile playing at the edges of something not quite its mouth. It had waited 3,821 years. Now, the waiting was over. The alarm screamed through the facility, a pulsive sound that rattled through Elias's skull as the prison walls trembled. The warden barked orders, his voice slicing through the chaos, but Elias barely heard him. His attention remained locked on the cat, small, still, impossibly calm amidst the storm it had set into motion. "Containment is failing," someone shouted. "Energy fluctuations across all sectors." Elias took an unconscious step forward. "What did I do?" The cat blinked up at him, golden eyes glinting in the flickering red light. "You were very helpful, Elias." A chill curled around his spine. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize manipulation when he saw it, but this was something else. It hadn't forced him. It hadn't tricked him. It had simply guided him, with patience, with precision, with the quiet certainty of something that had all the time in the universe to wait for the right moment. And Elias had given it that moment. The warden turned on him, face pale with fury. "What did you do?" "I don't." Elias's throat tightened. He didn't have an answer. He had retrieved a key. He had followed a path, but he had no idea what he had truly set free. The floor beneath them vibrated. No, not the floor. The air, it rippled, folding in on itself, like space was trying to rewrite its own shape. The walls, once lined with ancient glyphs, flickered, then dimmed. And for the first time in 3,821 years, the cell changed. A low hum resonated through the chamber, deep and unnatural. The cat stood, its tail flicking once, as if stretching after a long, patient rest. Around it, the fabric of reality trembled. "Seal the chamber," the warden bellowed. The security barriers roared to life, energy fields surging between the walls, sealing the space in layers upon layers of containment protocols. Guards reinforced their stance, weapons raised, eyes hard with barely masked terror. None of it mattered. Elias felt it before he saw it. A pressure in the air, a shift that had nothing to do with the alarms or the failing systems. It pressed against his ribs, curled into his thoughts, something vast and unshackled awakening in the space between seconds. The cat, no, the thing that had taken the shape of a cat, lifted its gaze to the ceiling and smiled. The lights died. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Not just the absence of light, but a consuming, endless void, deeper than anything Elias had ever known. The alarms choked to silence. The hum of containment vanished. The prison, for the first time in millennia, was still. Then the voices began. Not spoken, not heard, felt. Whispers curled through Elias's thoughts, threading through his mind like fingers running through silk. They were not words, not entirely, fragments of something ancient, something endless. "We are awake." Elias staggered, gripping his head, breath coming sharp and uneven. Around him, the guards wavered, some collapsing, others gasping as the weight of something far too vast to comprehend pressed into their skulls. The warden clutched his chest, choking out a strangled breath. And in the center of it all, the cat laughed. Not in sound, not in movement, but in the way the air rippled, in the way reality itself bent around its form. Elias forced himself to stand, muscles shaking, mind screaming at him to run. "What are you?" The cat turned to him, and for the first time, he saw it. Not the small, sleek shape it had worn, but the thing beneath, vast and unknowable. Not a creature, not a prisoner, a door. And now, the door was open. The whispers grew louder. Shapes flickered in the dark, things without form pressing against the edges of reality. Elias saw glimpses, worlds collapsing, stars unraveling, time folding in on itself like brittle paper. It was not destruction. It was not malice. It was absence. The warden fell to his knees, eyes wide with horror. "Shut it down," he rasped. "Shut it down now." But there was nothing to shut down. The cat stepped forward, moving past Elias, past the guards, unbothered by the weapons aimed at its head. "Your kind has forgotten," it murmured, voice curling into their minds like silk. "You built your empire atop old bones. You thought them dead." It turned its gaze to Elias, and in its golden eyes, he saw something endless. "You were wrong." The prison fractured, not with an explosion, not with destruction. It simply ceased. The walls, the barriers, the very concept of containment. Undone in an instant, swallowed into the nothingness that had waited patiently, so patiently, for this day to come. The guard vanished. The warden let out a strangled cry before the darkness claimed him. Elias did not run. He stood, breath shallow, as the thing before him unraveled. The cat's form flickered, stretched, expanded into something for which his mind had no words. And in its presence, Elias understood the truth. The empire had not imprisoned a creature. It had imprisoned the space between, a sliver of something greater, a fraction of a whole, a crack in the foundation of reality itself, held closed by the weight of millennia. And now it was free. The whispers grew deafening, folding into a sound Elias could not comprehend, could not endure. The darkness curled around him, swallowing the last remnants of the prison, of the world, of everything. And as the last light flickered out, he felt the cat's voice one final time. "Thank you." Then there was nothing.